Waiter humiliates deaf boy in cafe, unaware he's the owner's nephew. What would you do if a harmless gesture turned into a life-altering misunderstanding, setting off a chain of events no one could have predicted? The cafe buzzed with the low hum of conversations and clinking coffee cups. The cafe, Brew and Bliss, was nestled on a busy street corner, known for its rustic charm and aromatic coffee blends. Among the patrons, a young boy, Ethan Cole, with deep brown eyes, sat alone at a corner table, nervously tapping his fingers against the edge. Dressed modestly in a slightly oversized hoodie, he exuded an air of innocence. Behind the counter, a sharp-tongued waiter, Blake, was barking orders to the kitchen staff. His smirk was as sharp as his tone, a sign of his knack for finding amusement at others' expense. At another table, the cafe owner, Mr. Dawson, sat engrossed in paperwork, unaware of the brewing storm in his establishment. Establish the mystery conflict. The boy, Ethan, was not like the other customers. His world was silent, void of the cafe's lively chatter and the melodic clinking of dishes. Born deaf, Ethan communicated with his hands, gesturing to the waiter for assistance. Instead of responding, Blake snickered, misinterpreting Ethan's gestures as odd and attention-seeking. The tension escalated as the waiter's cruel remarks grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched, unsure whether to intervene. Ethan's face turned crimson, his hands shaking as he struggled to explain. Unbeknownst to Blake, the young boy he was humiliating wasn't just a random customer. He was the nephew of the cafe's owner, Mr. Dawson, and what was about to unfold would leave everyone in the room questioning their actions, their morals, and their own humanity. The cafe was a bustling hub, its charm drawing people from all walks of life. Among the regulars was Ethan Cole, a young deaf boy who frequented the place with his Aunt Sarah, who worked as a waitress there. Ethan, only 12, was a bright and curious soul who communicated through sign language with an enthusiasm that lit up the room. His parents had passed away in a tragic accident when he was 6, leaving Sarah to take him in and raise him as her own. Despite his challenges, Ethan was determined to navigate life with grace, finding solace in sketching in his notebook. His talent for drawing often caught the attention of the cafe patrons, who would stop to marvel at the details he captured in his art. Sarah, in her early 30s, was a hard-working woman with a kind heart. She adored her nephew and saw his talent as a beacon of hope in their lives. Working at the cafe wasn't just a job for her. It was a way to keep a stable life for Ethan. Though she often seemed cheerful, her colleagues knew she had her share of struggles. Raising Ethan alone was no easy task, but she carried on with unwavering determination. Enter Mark Lawson, the head waiter, a man known for his sharp tongue and unkind demeanor. At first glance, Mark seemed confident, but behind his air of arrogance lay years of insecurity. He had grown bitter over time, blaming his failures on everyone but himself. While Mark was efficient at his job, his short temper and tendency to demean others often left his co-workers frustrated. To him, Ethan was an inconvenience, someone who didn't belong in his cafe. Mark had little patience for the boy's presence, rolling his eyes whenever Ethan signed something to Sarah, or laughed silently at his sketches. Then, There was Mr. Bernard Harper, the cafe's enigmatic owner, a retired businessman in his 60s. Bernard preferred to keep a low profile, rarely stepping into the cafe except to manage operations behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to most, Bernard had a soft spot for his family, particularly his late sister's children. Ethan was his nephew, though Bernard had chosen to keep that connection a secret for reasons of his own. He wanted Ethan to have a normal life, uncolored by favoritism or pity. Finally, Lila Carter, a young barista and Sarah's closest ally at the cafe, stood out for her bubbly personality and quick wit. Lila often went out of her way to defend Sarah and Ethan from Mark's snide remarks. She had a sharp sense of justice and wasn't afraid to confront Mark when his behavior crossed the line. To Ethan, Lila was like an older sister, someone who always had his back and made him laugh even on the toughest days. The stage was set for an explosive confrontation. These characters, with their own flaws, struggles, and motivations, were about to become intertwined in a moment that would change everything. Mark's growing resentment toward Ethan and Sarah was a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right moment to detonate. And unbeknownst to him, the quiet, unassuming boy he looked down on would soon reveal a connection that would turn Mark's world upside down. As the days went on, tension simmered beneath the surface. Ethan's drawings of the cafe's regulars began to attract even more attention, earning him compliments that only fueled Mark's bitterness. One evening, as the cafe buzzed with activity, Mark spotted an opportunity to put Sarah and Ethan in their place. But what he didn't know was that his actions would set off a chain of events that would leave everyone questioning their assumptions about each other. With the characters' motivations and connections established, the story was primed for the crime, or in this case, the ultimate humiliation that would bring all their paths crashing together. Little did they know that in the chaos they would uncover truths about themselves and each other that would alter their lives forever. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the cafe closed earlier than usual due to the weather. The staff hurried to wrap up their tasks, the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows creating a rhythmic backdrop. Sarah had just finished counting the day's earnings while Ethan sat at his usual corner table, sketching furiously. Mark was grumbling as he wiped down the counters, his irritation palpable. Lila, ever cheerful, hummed a tune as she cleaned the espresso machine. At 8:15 p.m., just as the last lights were being switched off, a loud crash shattered the calm. The staff froze, their eyes darting to the source of the noise, the storage room at the back of the cafe. Lila, startled, dropped the rag she was holding. Mark let out an exasperated sigh, muttering something about rodents. Sarah instinctively moved toward Ethan, shielding him from what felt like an unseen threat. Mark, emboldened by his irritation, marched toward the storage room. "It's probably just a shelf falling over," he scoffed. But as he pushed the door open, the color drained from his face. "What the—" he whispered, stepping back. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Boxes were overturned, bags of coffee beans scattered across the floor. But the most alarming sight was the open safe embedded in the wall, completely empty. Sarah and Lila hurried over, and their shock mirrored Mark's. The safe had contained the cafe's weekly earnings, along with some personal items Bernard had stored there. Now, everything was gone. Sarah immediately checked the cafe's main entrance, but the door was still locked. There were no broken windows, no obvious signs of forced entry. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The thief was likely still inside. Lila called the police, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. The operator instructed them to stay together and wait for the officers to arrive. Sarah, trying to keep Ethan calm, whispered reassuring words to him in sign language. Ethan, however, seemed more intrigued than frightened, his sharp eyes darting around as if searching for clues. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, Detective Julia Monroe and her partner, Officer Sean Price. Detective Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving tough cases, immediately took charge. Her piercing gaze scanned the room as she listened to Lila recount the events. "Everyone stays here," Monroe instructed. "Officer Price will check the premises for any signs of an intruder." As Price began his search, Monroe turned her attention to the staff. She asked each of them to recount their movements during the evening. Mark, fidgeting nervously, was the first to speak. "I was cleaning the counters the whole time. I didn't hear or see anything suspicious until that crash." Lila's statement was similar, though she added that Mark had been unusually irritable that day. Sarah, on the other hand, mentioned something curious. Earlier that evening, she had seen a shadow pass by the frosted glass of the storage room door, but had dismissed it, thinking it was Mark. Detective Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Did you tell anyone about this shadow?" "No," Sarah admitted. "I didn't think it was important at the time." Monroe made a note of it, then turned to Ethan. "What about you, young man? Did you notice anything unusual?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then signed something to Sarah, who translated. "He says he saw Mark near the storage room just before the crash." Mark's face reddened. "That's ridiculous. I was at the counter the whole time." Before Monroe could respond, Officer Price returned, shaking his head. "No signs of an intruder, Detective. The doors and windows are all secure." This only deepened the mystery. How could someone have stolen the contents of the safe without leaving a trace? Monroe decided to examine the storage room herself. As she sifted through the mess, something caught her eye. A small piece of paper wedged under the safe. She carefully pulled it out and unfolded it. The paper contained a hastily scribbled note. "It's not what it seems. Look closer." Monroe's mind raced. Was this a clue left by the thief? Or a red herring meant to mislead the investigation? She knew one thing for certain. This case was far more complex than it appeared. Back in the main room, tensions were running high. Mark continued to insist on his innocence, while Sarah grew increasingly protective of Ethan. Lila, ever the peacemaker, tried to defuse the situation, but to no avail. As the first pieces of evidence began to emerge, so did the questions. Who had access to the safe's combination? Why was there no sign of forced entry? And most importantly, what did the cryptic note mean? Detective Monroe glanced at the staff, her instincts telling her that someone in the room wasn't being entirely truthful. The investigation had only just begun, but it was already clear. This wasn't just a simple case of theft. There were secrets buried beneath the surface, and Monroe was determined to unearth them all. Detective Julia Monroe sat at the counter of the cafe, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the staff as Officer Price meticulously dusted the storage room for fingerprints. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone seemed to be tiptoeing around each other, their glances fleeting and suspicious. Monroe broke the silence. "Mark, you mentioned you were cleaning the counters. Did you happen to see anyone go near the storage room? Mark, still visibly annoyed by the implied suspicion, shook his head. Number I was focused on finishing my shift. Yet Ethan says he saw you near the storage room just before the crash, Monroe countered. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Officer Price entered the room, holding a small, black leather glove. Found this under the shelving in the storage room. It's damp, like it's been outside recently. Monroe's eyes narrowed. Does this belong to any of you? The staff exchanged puzzled glances. Lila shook her head first. Sarah followed, and Ethan signed a clear no to Sarah, who translated. Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second before denying it. Monroe noticed the pause but didn't comment. Instead, she bagged the glove as evidence. As she turned back to the group, Ethan caught her attention. He was frantically signing to Sarah, his expression a mix of fear and urgency. Sarah translated, "He says he saw someone standing outside the cafe earlier, just across the street watching us. A tall man in a black coat. He thought it was strange, but didn't want to say anything because he didn't recognize him." Monroe's ears perked up. Did anyone else see this man? Lila frowned. Now that he mentions it, I did notice someone standing there when I was taking out the trash. I didn't get a good look, though. I thought it was just a passerby, Mark scoffed. This is ridiculous. We're jumping at shadows. It's probably just some random guy. What does that have to do with the safe? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything, Monroe replied evenly, her mind racing. The next morning, Monroe received a call from Officer Price. "Detective, we've got a problem. The glove doesn't match anyone's prints here, but the fibers inside match the lining of the safe. It's definitely connected." Monroe frowned. "That's odd. It doesn't fit our suspects yet." "Anything else?" Price hesitated. "Yeah. We also found traces of blood on the edge of the safe. It's small, like a scratch, but enough to run a test. Lab results should be in by tomorrow." Monroe hung up, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her. The mysterious man in the black coat, the glove, the blood, it all pointed to something larger than a simple theft. Later that day, Monroe returned to the cafe with Officer Price. She had a new plan. Reenact the events of the night to see if anyone's story didn't hold up. The staff reluctantly complied. Mark was especially resistant, muttering under his breath about how pointless it was. Lila, on the other hand, seemed eager to help, while Sarah remained stoic, translating Ethan's occasional input. As they walked through the evening's events, Monroe noticed small discrepancies. For instance, Mark claimed he hadn't touched the storage room door, yet a faint smudge that matched his fingerprints was found near the handle. When confronted, he stammered, "I must have brushed against it earlier in the day. I swear, I didn't do anything." Then there was Sarah, who insisted she had stayed near Ethan the whole time. Yet when Monroe pointed out that Ethan had mentioned seeing the shadow and hearing muffled voices near the storage room, Sarah quickly corrected him, saying he probably misunderstood what he saw. Monroe filed these observations away, but didn't press further for now. That evening, a call came in from the lab. The blood on the safe's edge matched a man with a criminal record for burglary, Dominic Grayson. Grayson had been released from prison just 2 months earlier and was known for his meticulous, nearly untraceable methods. Monroe's instincts buzzed with new possibilities. Was Grayson the man in the black coat? If so, how did he know about the safe? When Monroe shared this information with the team, Lila gasped. "I remember that name. Dominic Grayson. He used to work here years ago. Bernard fired him for stealing. This revelation threw the investigation into overdrive. Monroe immediately issued a BOLO for Grayson, but something still didn't sit right. Grayson might have the motive, but the crime scene suggested an inside job. How had he gained access to the safe's combination? The next day brought another twist. A neighbor across the street came forward, claiming to have seen a car parked outside the cafe the night of the robbery. The description matched a rental car registered to Mark. When confronted, Mark's demeanor shifted entirely. "Fine, I was there, but I didn't steal anything," he blurted out. "I went back because I forgot my phone. When I got to the storage room, I heard someone inside. I panicked and left. I didn't say anything because I thought it would make me look guilty." Monroe's eyes bore into him, assessing his story. Was Mark just a frightened witness, or was he hiding something more sinister? The mystery deepened as Monroe pieced together the puzzle, but the pieces refused to fit neatly. The glove, the blood, Grayson's history, Mark's suspicious behavior, and Sarah's attempts to shield Ethan. It all pointed to secrets within secrets. As Monroe reviewed the evidence late into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was right in front of her, buried under layers of deception. The case had reached a critical juncture, and the next move would determine whether they uncovered the truth or fell further into the web of lies. Mini cliffhangers. Detective Monroe carefully examined the black leather glove found in the storage room. Something about it felt intentional. As she studied it under the bright interrogation room light, a peculiar marking on the inside caught her eye, a small, barely noticeable embroidered G. "Price?" Monroe called out, her tone urgent. "Find out if this glove matches any of Grayson's previous possessions. If it does, we might have our man." Before Price could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Another officer leaned in, holding a folder. "Detective, lab results just came in. You'll want to see this." Monroe opened the folder, her expression darkening as she scanned the page. "This changes everything," she muttered, slamming the folder shut. But what did the results reveal? Ethan was hesitant, his hand shaking as he signed to Sarah, who translated his words for Detective Monroe. "He says he saw more than a shadow outside the cafe," Sarah said, her voice uneasy. He saw someone go into the storage room, but he didn't recognize their face." Monroe frowned. Why didn't he say this earlier? Ethan's reply was quick, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "He says he was scared. He thinks someone might be watching him." Monroe leaned forward. "Who, Ethan? Who do you think is watching you?" But Ethan just shook his head, signing one final word before shutting down completely. Danger. Who or what was Ethan so afraid of? As Monroe interrogated Mark about the rental car, his carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. "I already told you," he said, his voice growing louder. "I didn't see anyone that night." Monroe's sharp gaze never wavered. "That's funny," she said, pulling out a photo. "This surveillance footage shows your car parked in front of the cafe at 1:34 a.m. Care to explain?" Mark's face paled, and he fumbled for words. "Okay, fine. I was there, but I didn't go inside. I saw someone else, a man in black. He was walking out with something in his hands." "And you didn't report it?" Monroe pressed. "I didn't think he saw me," Mark whispered. "But now, I'm not so sure." "What did Mark see?" And was he safe now? A knock at Monroe's office door revealed a new lead. A local neighbor, Mrs. Elkins, had come forward with an unexpected detail. "Detective," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I saw something that night." Monroe motioned for her to continue. "It was around midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I looked out my window, and there was a car idling outside the cafe. But there wasn't just one person. I saw two." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "Two people? Did you recognize either of them?" Mrs. Elkins hesitated, wringing her hands. "Not exactly, but one of them. They had a very distinct limp." Monroe froze. A limp! That detail struck a nerve. She grabbed the case files, flipping through them furiously. Somewhere in her notes, she had seen that description before. Could this be the missing piece of the puzzle? Each cliffhanger leaves the audience hungry for answers, ensuring they stay engaged and eager to unravel the next layer of the mystery. The investigation had reached a standstill. For weeks, Detective Monroe and her team had combed through evidence, interviewed witnesses, and pursued countless leads. But nothing concrete had emerged. The mounting pressure from the media and the victim's family was suffocating. Just as hope began to wane, an overlooked piece of evidence finally came into focus. It started with a seemingly innocuous detail: an old storage receipt found in the bottom drawer of the victim's desk. The receipt, dated 3 days before the murder, indicated a locker rental at a facility across town. At first glance, it appeared unrelated. Why would the victim, a young cafe owner, rent a storage locker so abruptly? Monroe decided to investigate. Arriving at the dimly lit storage facility, she approached the locker with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. As the roll-up door creaked open, the stale air hit her like a wall. Inside, she found boxes stacked haphazardly. It wasn't until she opened the third box that she discovered something that made her heart race: a stack of envelopes, each labeled with a name. The names were familiar: former employees, business associates, and even loyal customers of the cafe. Inside each envelope were detailed records of financial transactions. Monroe's breath hitched as she noticed discrepancies in the amounts. It became clear that the victim had been conducting a shadow operation, siphoning money from multiple sources. But why? And for whom? Among the envelopes was one that stood out. It was marked only with the initials GR. Inside was a single photograph of the victim, arm in arm with a man Monroe didn't recognize. The back of the photograph was scrawled with the words, "Debt paid in full, August 15th. The date was eerily close to the day the victim was murdered. Monroe rushed the evidence to the forensic team, and their findings were explosive. The handwriting on the photograph matched that of Grayson Roberts, a local businessman with a shady reputation. Roberts had been questioned early in the investigation, but dismissed due to a lack of evidence. However, this revelation placed him squarely back in the spotlight. But the twist didn't end there. Monroe received a call from Price, who had been reviewing security footage from the cafe's parking lot on the night of the murder. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to identify two figures in the alleyway behind the cafe. One was the victim. The other was unmistakably Grayson Roberts. The timestamp was 11:47 p.m., less than an hour before the estimated time of death. As Monroe analyzed the footage, something unexpected caught her eye. A third figure, hidden in the shadows, was watching the interaction. The figure's posture and movements were familiar, but their identity remained unclear. Monroe's gut told her this shadowy observer held the key to unraveling the case. Later that evening, Monroe received another breakthrough. A fingerprint lifted from the storage receipt matched none other than Ethan, the deaf cafe worker, who had claimed he wasn't at the scene that night. The revelation was jarring. Ethan had been a trusted source of information, but now his involvement in the crime seemed undeniable. Ethan's confession only deepened the mystery. If he was acting under the victim's instructions, who was the real puppet master? And what role did Grayson Roberts play in all of this? The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Elkins, the neighbor who had earlier mentioned seeing two figures on the night of the murder. Revisiting her statement, Monroe pressed for more details. "I didn't want to get involved," Mrs. Elkins admitted, wringing her hands. "But now that I think about it, one of them had a limp, and the other was carrying something shiny. That was it." Monroe's mind raced as she connected the dots. The shiny object was likely the murder weapon, and the limp matched a profile in their database. Mark, a former cafe employee with a history of petty theft and violent altercations. Confronting Mark was the turning point. Cornered with the evidence, he confessed to being in the alley that night, but insisted he didn't kill the victim. "I was there to scare him," Mark admitted, his voice cracking. "But Roberts, he's the one who wanted him dead. I swear, I didn't do it." Mark's confession brought everything into sharp focus. The victim had been skimming money to pay off debts owed to Roberts. When the victim tried to break free from Roberts' grip, things turned deadly. Mark had been a pawn in Roberts' sinister game, and Ethan's involvement was born out of fear and loyalty. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the team knew they still needed more to take Roberts down for good. Emotional highs. The air in the courtroom was stifling as the victim's mother, Mrs. Hartwell, took the stand. Clutching a framed photo of her son, she looked at the jury with tear-filled eyes. "He was my only child," she began, her voice trembling. "He had dreams of turning that little cafe into something big, but now all I have left are memories." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. She described her son as a dreamer, a hard-working young man who never hesitated to help those in need. "He was too kind," she said, her voice breaking. "And I think that's what got him killed." A murmur spread through the courtroom as she wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Grayson Roberts, seated at the defendant's table, remained expressionless. His calm demeanor only fueled the growing anger in the victim's family. Mrs. Hartwell glared at him, her sorrow momentarily giving way to rage. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How could you take him away from us?" The prosecution, sensing the emotional momentum, introduced a series of recordings obtained from the victim's phone. The first was a voicemail from Roberts, his voice laced with threats. "You think you can walk away from me? You owe me, and I always get what I'm owed." The jury shifted uncomfortably as the recordings played. Each word painted a vivid picture of the fear the victim must have felt in his final days. Mrs. Hartwell covered her face, unable to listen to the final message. "You're out of time." The tension reached a breaking point when Ethan, the cafe worker, was called to testify. Sitting nervously at the stand, he glanced at the jury and then at Roberts, his hands trembling. Through his interpreter, Sarah, he described how Roberts had coerced him into silence. He said, "If I talked, I'd end up like my boss, Ethan signed, his hands shaking. The room collectively gasped. Ethan broke down as he described the night of the murder. I saw them arguing, he signed, tears streaming down his face. I wanted to help, but I was too scared. I ran and hid. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe. His guilt was palpable, and his testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. The emotional intensity only grew when the victim's best friend, Maya, took the stand. She recounted their last conversation just hours before the murder. He told me he was scared, but that he had a plan to fix everything, she said, choking back tears. He said he was finally going to be free. Maya pulled a crumpled letter from her bag, which the victim had written, but never sent. If anything happens to me, tell my mom I love her, it read. The courtroom was silent, except for the muffled sobs of the victim's family. Detective Monroe, sitting in the audience, felt the weight of these testimonies deeply. She had spent months piecing together this case, but hearing these personal accounts brought a new level of gravity to her work. She couldn't help but think of her own family and what she would do if faced with such a loss. Then came the most gut-wrenching moment, a playback of the security footage from the cafe's alley on the night of the murder. As the grainy images flickered on the screen, the jury watched in horror as the confrontation between the victim and Roberts unfolded. When the shadowy figure, later identified as Mark, appeared on the screen, the tension in the room was palpable. The footage showed Mark hesitating, stepping back, as Roberts pulled a weapon from his coat. The victim's desperate pleas were inaudible, but his body language spoke volumes. Mrs. Hartwell broke into sobs as the final moments of her son's life played out on the screen. Several jurors wiped their eyes, visibly shaken by the footage. The video ended with the victim collapsing to the ground, and the screen went black. In the days following the testimony, the emotional toll of the case weighed heavily on everyone involved. The victim's family and friends sat through each session, reliving their loss in agonizing detail. The jury, tasked with delivering justice, bore the burden of deciding the fate of a man whose actions had devastated so many lives. Detective Monroe, reflecting on the case, knew they were nearing the end. But the road to justice was fraught with heartbreak, and the emotional highs of the trial would stay with everyone for a long time. As the prosecution rested their case, the room held its collective breath, knowing the moment of truth was just around the corner. Detective Monroe stared at the evidence board, her fingers tracing the outline of a photo pinned to the corner. An old group picture of the cafe staff taken just weeks before the murder. Something about it didn't sit right. She leaned in closer, her mind racing. Every piece of the puzzle felt like it was there, scattered before her, but the connection was still just out of reach. Then it clicked. In the photograph, tucked near the back of the group, stood Mark. He wasn't a current employee of the cafe. His name hadn't appeared in any of the staff records. But Monroe recalled his name coming up during witness interviews, always as someone who seemed to be around but never directly involved. What was he hiding? Pulling up Mark's file, Monroe unearthed a detail that had previously been overlooked. A prior connection to Grayson Roberts. The two men had worked together at a construction site 5 years earlier, and their relationship had ended abruptly following allegations of theft. Allegations Roberts had managed to dodge. while Mark was dismissed without pay. Monroe's heart raced as she cross-referenced the timeline. Could this entire crime have been a premeditated act of revenge? It wasn't just about the victim, it seemed. It was about settling old scores. The revelation shook the entire team. Mark had positioned himself perfectly to observe the cafe and its routines, likely feeding Roberts critical information to orchestrate the crime. But why hadn't he come forward earlier? And why was his behavior during the investigation so erratic? Monroe immediately issued a warrant to search Mark's residence. What they uncovered there shifted the case dramatically. Hidden in a false compartment of his closet was a phone belonging to the victim. It contained text messages between Mark and Roberts, detailing plans to confront the victim about an unpaid debt. The text made it clear the intention was intimidation, but something had gone horribly wrong. The final text exchange sent chills down Monroe's spine. Mark had written, "If this goes sideways, you'll have to clean it up. I'm not going down for you again." To which Roberts had chillingly replied, "You'll do as you're told." This discovery didn't just implicate Roberts as the mastermind. It also positioned Mark as a critical player in the crime. The text indicated he was present during the murder, and while he may not have delivered the fatal blow, his role was undeniable. The most shocking revelation came when forensics analyzed the phone. A deleted video, recovered by the tech team, showed Mark filming the confrontation from the shadows. In the grainy footage, the victim's desperate attempts to reason with Roberts were visible, and the sound of a gunshot rang out before the camera abruptly cut off. Mark was brought in for questioning, his face pale and gaunt. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he stammered. "I thought it was just going to be a scare. I didn't know he'd—" His voice trailed off, his guilt evident. When asked why he hadn't come forward sooner, Mark broke down. "He threatened me. Said if I talked, I'd be next." The room fell silent as Monroe presented the final piece of evidence, the cafe's security footage from that fateful night. Enhanced audio captured Robert's voice, cold and menacing, saying, "This ends tonight. No one's leaving until I get what I came for." The discovery of the hidden phone, the recovered video, and Mark's confession turned the case on its head. What had initially seemed like a straightforward crime of passion now revealed itself as a calculated act involving layers of manipulation and fear. As Monroe stared at the evidence now piled high on her desk, she felt both satisfaction and dread. The victim's family would soon learn the full extent of the betrayal and violence that had taken their loved one away, a revelation that would leave scars long after the case was closed. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Grayson Roberts and Mark Taylor began. After months of painstaking investigation, the prosecution had built an airtight case, supported by Mark's reluctant confession, the damning text messages, and the recovered video footage. The victim's family sat silently in the front row, their faces etched with pain, but resolute in their pursuit of justice. As the evidence was presented, the jury listened intently. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of the crime. Roberts, driven by greed and a need to settle personal scores, had masterminded the entire scheme, using Mark as a pawn. Mark's role in luring the victim into a vulnerable position and his complicity in the aftermath left no room for doubt about his involvement. In a dramatic turn, Mark chose to testify against Roberts in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was raw and emotional. "He controlled everything," Mark confessed, his voice trembling. I didn't have a choice. He told me I'd regret it if I didn't go along with his plan. The defense tried to portray Mark as an unreliable witness, pointing to his role in the crime and his attempts to cover up his involvement. However, the prosecution countered with forensic evidence, including the video that captured Roberts' voice commanding Mark to comply. When Roberts took the stand, his demeanor was cold and calculated. He denied all charges, claiming that Mark had acted alone and that the texts were taken out of context. But his confidence began to waver under cross-examination when confronted with inconsistencies in his statements. The trial culminated in a dramatic moment when the prosecution played the recovered video for the jury. The grainy footage and chilling audio laid bare the violence and manipulation that had taken place. Gasps filled the courtroom as the jury witnessed the final moments of the victim's life, bringing the reality of the crime into sharp focus. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts for Grayson Roberts, including first-degree murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Mark Taylor was found guilty of accessory to murder, but received a lesser sentence due to his cooperation with the investigation. The sentencing hearing was an emotional affair. The victim's family gave a heart-wrenching statement about the impact of the crime on their lives. "No sentence will ever bring our loved one back," the victim's mother said, tears streaming down her face. "But knowing that justice has been served gives us a small measure of peace." For Detective Monroe and her team, the resolution brought mixed emotions. The satisfaction of solving the case was tempered by the weight of the tragedy they had uncovered. "This isn't about winning," Monroe said in a press conference following the verdict. "It's about ensuring that no one else suffers like this family has. Justice doesn't undo the harm, but it holds those responsible accountable." As the courtroom emptied and the media swarmed outside, the victim's family lingered for a moment, holding onto each other tightly. Though their journey toward healing was just beginning, they left with a sense of closure, knowing that the truth had finally come to light. In the days following the trial, the case became a topic of national discussion, sparking conversations about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of speaking out against intimidation and abuse. While the scars left by the crime would never fully heal, the resolution offered a reminder that justice, though slow and imperfect, can prevail. The investigation had dragged on for months, with leads that seemed promising crumbling under closer scrutiny. Detective Monroe was feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her, the haunting eyes of the victim's family driving her to push harder, despite the mounting frustration. Then came the moment that changed everything. A routine forensic sweep of the victim's car, which had been sitting in impound for weeks, yielded an overlooked clue. A small, battered USB drive lodged under the passenger seat. Initially dismissed as unimportant, the tech team discovered that it contained an encrypted folder. Hours of painstaking decryption revealed what could only be described as a bombshell. A series of documents and videos implicating Grayson Roberts, a respected local businessman, in a web of criminal activities far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The contents of the drive were staggering. Among the files was a grainy video showing Roberts meeting with an unidentified accomplice in a dimly lit warehouse, discussing details of the crime. Their voices, though muffled, left little room for interpretation. "We can't leave any loose ends," Roberts was heard saying, his tone cold, and commanding. The documents provided further evidence of Roberts' motive. Bank statements revealed that he had embezzled millions from his own company, and the victim, a former employee, had recently uncovered the fraud. The victim's whistleblower report, partially drafted and saved on the USB drive, was a chilling testament to their determination to expose the truth, right before their life was abruptly cut short. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the detectives unearthed another twist. Mark Taylor, who had been dismissed as a low-level associate, was not just complicit, but had been coerced into participation. His phone records showed a series of threatening messages from Roberts in the weeks leading up to the crime. One text read, "If you don't do exactly what I say, you'll regret it. Your family won't be safe." Confronted with the evidence, Mark Taylor broke under pressure during an interrogation. His confession was a harrowing recounting of how Roberts had manipulated him, exploiting his financial struggles and fear for his family's safety. "He made it seem like I had no choice," Mark sobbed. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, but he wouldn't let me walk away." The revelation painted a devastating picture of the crime's orchestration. Roberts had meticulously planned every detail, ensuring that Mark would take the fall if things went awry. It wasn't just about silencing the victim. It was about protecting Roberts's carefully constructed facade of success and respectability. The discovery of the USB drive turned the case on its head, but it also raised the stakes. The detectives knew they needed more to secure a conviction against someone as powerful as Roberts. Surveillance footage from the warehouse, combined with the digital evidence, strengthened their case. However, the most damning evidence came from a surprising source. A former associate of Roberts who came forward after hearing about the USB drive on the news. This associate, under the condition of anonymity, revealed even more about Roberts' illicit dealings and provided corroboration for Mark's confession. "He's been running schemes like this for years," the associate disclosed. "Anyone who crossed him ended up ruined, or worse." The investigation team realized they were on the brink of exposing not just a murder, but a larger criminal enterprise. With the weight of the new evidence, Detective Monroe and her team prepared to confront Roberts, knowing that this was the turning point they had been waiting for. The tension reached its zenith when they executed a warrant to search Roberts' estate. There, hidden in a locked safe, they found the final piece of the puzzle, a handwritten ledger detailing payments to accomplices, including Mark, and a meticulous account of how the crime had been staged to look like a random act of violence. As Detective Monroe reviewed the evidence, she couldn't shake the chilling realization of how close Roberts had come to getting away with everything. The pieces were all in place now, and the time had come to bring the truth to light. The key revelation was not just the crime itself, but the sheer depth of Roberts's deception and the lives he had destroyed in his ruthless pursuit of self-preservation. As the dust settles and justice is served, the case serves as a sobering reminder of the lengths some will go to in order to protect their own interests. Roberts, once a pillar of the community, now stands as a symbol of corruption and betrayal, leaving behind shattered lives in his wake. But as one chapter closes, the broader questions linger. How many others like him are out there, hidden in plain sight? How far does the ripple effect of one crime spread? For the victims' families, the journey is far from over. Though justice was achieved, healing takes time, and not every scar can be erased. The case may be closed, but the investigation into Robert's far-reaching criminal network is only beginning. In the end, perhaps the true question lies not in solving the case, but in understanding the darkness that can exist within even the most seemingly perfect lives.